Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Yandra Vinaka, bonjour, talofalava, and welcome back to day 2 of training. We would like to thank you for your participation yesterday and hope that today will be as fulfilling as it was yesterday. If you are here for the first time, welcome and thank you for joining. We would like to take a moment to think of our close neighbors, Tonga, who was affected by the volcano in the last weeks. And we also think of our friends in Kiribati who are suffering from COVID now, and our thoughts are with you. Just a few housekeeping duties. If you are not speaking, please ensure your mic is turned off and have them on when you do speak. Just as in the video, if you have any technical difficulties, please message the host or you can log off and log in again. And do not worry, we will let you back in. Just on the interpretations, because people will be joining in now and then during the breakout, during the modules, we will continue to announce how to get interpretations. Also, because we have both French and English-speaking moderators and facilitators, we do encourage the English-speaking participants to do select the English interpretation. Now let us go on briefly over the agenda for today. So today we will be recapping on day 1. And we will also be doing module 2, which will be the nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation by Mathilde Craft. And then after that, we'll have a picture taken and then our breakout rooms will commence. Module 3, access to climate finance, straight after that. And then we'll have a 5 minutes break shortly after. And then we will have our last module, access to climate finance, the completion of module 3. And then we will have our workshop closing and evaluation. Just a very kind reminder, we had evaluations for day 1 sent out to all the participants. And we kindly request if you'll be able to fill in the day 1 evaluation forms now and throughout module 2, as it covers nature-based solutions in that evaluation. Level. We will now give a brief recap for day 1. This is from Anne Claire, who was a moderator for day 1. Yesterday was one of the training workshops, NDCs, access to climate finance and nature-based solutions for climate change adaptations. This 2 days workshop is co-organized by the NDC Hub, Kiwa Initiative, Climate Finance Units, by capitalizing on the strengths of the NDC Hub partners, the Pacific Community, SPC, and the Secretary of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, SPREP. 70 people attended this first day, focusing on setting the scene of climate change and NDCs and introducing nature-based solutions. Our colleagues Vanda from SPREP presented how IPCC reports described in an unequivocal way the scientific basis of the climate situation, proofs, consequences of climate change. She introduced the UN climate change regime and on mitigations and adaptations as the major responses to climate change. It is pointed out that development as usual might even foster climate change and harm the environment if not considered in development, planning, project proposal development. Nationally determined contribution, NDCs, are fundamental and form the core of the Paris Agreement and provide the framework for countries' climate policies, country ownership, alignment with national policies and stakeholders. Engagement is key to the success on NDCs. Participants during the workshop raised a lot of questions around concrete actions that can be implemented for atoll islands. how we can be more strategic to achieve our NDCs. And how about NDCs at individual levels? That is, what can you do to help make a small difference in our environment sooner rather than later? It has also raised issues of the sustainability of NDCs in terms of country ownership. Nature-based solutions plays a crucial role in climate change mitigation and adaptations. They often serve as an effective carbon sink and increase communities' resilience to the impacts of climate change, to the reductions of impacts from natural disasters, including floods, storm surges, and droughts. Importantly, human adaptations to the impacts of climate change cannot be achieved only through mitigation actions, such as energy efficiency and technology and knowledge transfer, but more importantly, via nature-based solutions. Participants wanted additional information on what is requested by donors in project proposals, example, baseline information, and how can nature-based solutions effectively be implemented to address environmental issues. This training seeks to encourage opportunities to integrate NBS into NDCs as part of climate commitments. It aims to enhance the knowledge of NBS for climate change mitigation and adaptations, and the opportunity for contracting parties to include in their NDCs. Today, we will focus more on why nature-based solution is a tool and present this opportunity and challenges for countries regarding national and international climate finances. Thank you. We will now move on to the first module this morning. We had left off with the introduction of nature-based solutions by Ludovic, and we will now touch on the tools that Ludovic was previewing us to. We would like to invite Mathilde Kraft from SPREP. She recently joined SPREP Coastal and Marine team as the Kiwa coordinator. Before that, she served in the French Public Service under the Prime Minister on Blue Economy and Marine Environment Protection Corporation. Without further ado, Mathilde, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sadie, for the introduction and the recap. And good morning, everyone. I'll be sharing my presentation. Can you all see it?
Yes, perfect.
And thank you. And stopping my camera, hopefully. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. My name is Mathilde Kraft. I'm joining from French Polynesia today. And I'm really happy to continue after Ludovic's great presentation yesterday on a module 2 on NBS and NDCs. And today we'll be looking a bit more details of what we mean by NBS as tools for climate change mitigation and adaptation, with examples from the Pacific. So I'll be first explaining a bit more how it works, looking especially at ecosystem-based adaptation and the rationale behind the promotion of these approaches. And then I'll be developing a bit more on examples of the Pacific and looking at lessons learned from past and current projects. And then we'll be looking at how we can go from the local scale to actually mentioning these solutions into policy and how that relates to the NDCs. And at the end of my presentation, I've added some links to resources and tools that can help you, including ecosystem-based adaptation and NBS in your work. So first, nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and mitigation with a focus on ecosystem-based adaptation. So what is EBA? As Ludovic mentioned yesterday, NBS, nature-based solutions, is really an umbrella term. It's always working with ecosystems to achieve social benefits mostly, and they can have different objectives. Here, we're really focusing on NBS specifically applying to climate change response, and so more specifically to ecosystem-based adaptation. So of course, yes, as Ludwig mentioned, working with nature is not new under the sun. People have been adapting to changing conditions, building on nature's services for a long time. But really what's with this framework is this idea of really strengthening biodiversity and ecosystems, specifically to climate change response. And there's been a lot of theoretical and practical work led mostly by IUCN to develop a bit more the framework and the concepts. So I've used a definition from IUCN for ecosystem-based adaptation, and it's really combining biodiversity and ecosystem services into an adaptation and development strategy that increases the resilience of ecosystems and communities to climate change through the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of ecosystems. So it's really these three main types of approaches: the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of ecosystems that makes EBA. And throughout the presentation, I'll be using EBA or nature-based solutions for climate change response a bit interchangeably. So really here you can on the graph on the side, also from IUCN, it really highlights the key premise of EBA, which is that if ecosystems are protected, remediated or regenerated, this will lead to healthier ecosystems, improved or increased ecosystem services that they usually provide. And this includes human well-being and resilience to the impacts of climate change, but also climate change mitigation. And it's another key feature of EBA is that it's really about strengthening the resilience of ecosystems through biodiversity conservation. And it's really an opportunity to address both global crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss. So we know now there's been a lot of work from the intergovernmental platform on climate change and on biodiversity and ecosystem services to actually work together. And the outcome of that workshop in 2020 was really that without biodiversity conservation, climate change adaptation actions will not be as efficient and will not be sustainable. So it's really crucial to address these two crises. Similarly, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse have really been identified as a top 5 global risks in the 10 coming years. That was in 2020, so there's only 8 years left. And really, so ecosystem-based adaptation is about strengthening biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services. But what's really unique is that it also seeks to address the drivers of environmental degradation, and this is often unsustainable development. So EBA is really pushed forward as a first cost-effective approach to address the many different threats to ecosystems. And so yesterday, Amit had this great graph as well on threats and solutions to climate change. Here is really a focus on our island ecosystems, recognizing that really the main current drivers of ecosystem degradations are related to unsustainable development processes. And this includes mining and logging, which leads to soil erosion and the runoff of nutrients down the water column, and in the end to the sea, which can then lead to the suffocation of reefs, pollution and waste, unsustainable coastal development, for instance, infrastructures that would limit the ability of coastal ecosystems to move and adapt, unsustainable fishing practices that would damage the seafloor or put pressure on ecosystems, and that can alter all reef functions, for instance, and lots of emerging issues. And these are really, so these fragilize ecosystems and limit their ability to then cope with the negative impacts of climate change. such as well, sea level rise or heat waves and storms. We've already been, we're all aware of, sadly, of these issues now. And so here is a bit a figure really highlighting how it works, and highlighting as well the circularity of impact. So the negative impacts of climate change on ecosystems and on people, are reinforcing and unsuitable adaptation options, such as the creation of forests in suitable areas, can actually have reinforced these negative impacts and lead to less resilience of both people and ecosystems. And on the contrary, what we see is that adaptation for biodiversity, so actions on restoration, for instance, of forests or river and wetlands, will come to reinforce ecosystems. And in return, these healthy ecosystems will be able to then have positive impacts on climate change through ecosystem-based mitigation, as well as providing adaptation services to people. And so there are many different approaches that are useful to NDS and that are part of ecosystem-based approaches. Ludovic has mentioned some of them yesterday. You have restoration, infrastructure related, management or protection. And in the Pacific, we have lots of different examples. For instance, the more relevant are the conservation or restoration of terrestrial forests or mangroves, of wetlands or seagrass, coral reefs, or coral reef restoration through coral reef gardening, for instance, dunes and beaches protection, the diversification as well, and protection of ecosystem-based livelihoods. So this is particularly recognizing that some important services to livelihoods, such as fisheries, agriculture or ecotourism, will be really impacted by climate change. Fisheries are really depleting as well. Climate change will affect the biology of fishes, and leading to less stocks, and the tuna, as you know, may be migrating out of their usual routes. So this idea is really to find other ways to get income for people that usually relied on these ecosystems, and this can include seaweed farming and the whole blue economy options. So yeah, other examples include sustainable fisheries management, terrestrial and marine protected areas, coastal retreats. This is particularly relevant to inundations, for instance. This means changing the coastline and finding designing specific areas that will be flooded to protect the rest of the coastline. Often these are part of larger interventions integrated into with, for instance, elevation of the coast, hard infrastructures to elevate the coastline. But yeah, and these coastal retreats can also be an opportunity to create new habitats, new wetlands, for instance. So you can have biodiversity benefits. And then you have living breakwaters, meaning, for instance, artificial reefs, as well as agroforestry and agroecology. So here I wanted to highlight some really key ecosystem services for both the climate change adaptation, but also mitigation services. And these are the blue carbon ecosystems. So blue carbon is the carbon captured and stored by the ocean and coastal ecosystems, such as mangroves, seagrass meadows, and salt marshes. To some extent, it's also the deep ocean ecosystems and macroalgae. And so these ecosystems really stock carbon by pulling out of oceans and atmosphere, and they store it in their roots and mud. And actually, these ecosystems are really efficient to store carbon. An hectare of seagrass, for instance, can store up to 126 tons of carbon in its soil. So it's really important to protect them for the services they provide, but also because destroying them actually releases carbon and aggravates the climate crisis. So there's protecting or restoring them can have many co-benefits for community resilience. It's the classic protection against storms and sea level rise, but it's also increases marine resources and can protect keystone species such like dugongs in seagrass meadows. And so, yeah, it has really great benefits to biodiversity conservation through spawning grounds and climate change mitigation, as they're able to reduce GHG emissions by stocking the carbon from the atmosphere, but they're also able to reduce ocean acidification on site by also removing the carbon from the ocean. And this in return will help the resilience of coral reefs and this circle of positive impacts. And what's interesting as well is that there's a whole number of initiatives that seek to count this carbon sequestered into national GHGs inventories and annual carbon emissions reporting. So that can also be included in NDCs. And yeah, I've included in the resources some key steps that the UNDP has identified to include NBS solutions in the NDC. So yeah, moving forward on some practical examples of NBS interventions in the Pacific. First, I wanted to highlight that EBA or nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation are not just about the conservation or sustainable management or restoration of ecosystems. It's a whole approach with sort of big key principles. The first one is that it's participatory and community-based, but it really needs to be locally led. So building on local assets and the priorities of the beneficiaries for sustainable development, adapted to the local scale, but with the potential to scale up at regional and national levels. They may be based on science. And Vanda mentioned yesterday that although it's important to have the baseline data, which oftentimes is missing, the baseline data on the environment status, but also on future trends and future climate impacts when planning, and to build on local knowledge and experience, because yes, people have been in the Pacific have been adapting to their environment for a long time, but sadly in recent years we've all been already seeing the impacts of climate change, and there's already a lot of experience in adapting to it. So this can also include local and traditional ecological knowledge. That's key as well for sound ecosystem adaptation interventions. Then again, of course, the point is to prioritize ecosystem services that build resilience to and mitigate climate change. So really adaptation must be the main objective of these actions. And then to focus on ecological, social, and economic connectivity, meaning that when you look at the scale of your intervention, it's important to understand the links between the people and the different ecosystems, but also the broader picture, how that relates to how they are connected to the broader region or other ecosystems. And then a key factor as well is to seek to maximize co-benefits for livelihoods, meaning trying to implement income generating activities, especially when you're looking at actions that will potentially limit the access or the use of natural resources from their usual users. And so we've discussed already potential diversification of livelihoods, but that's really to ensure that people will benefit actually from the actions, and they'll be wanting and in the capacity to sustain in the long run these actions. And they also, and that's a key part of the NBS, it's really looking at gender equity and social inclusion, both in the design, but as well as, including in your design gender information and gender-based analysis, but really having gender equity and social inclusion as one of the main objectives of your actions. It's really key for sustainability. And then again, the great asset of ecosystem approach is that it's really flexible and it can be adapted to existing initiatives. And that's the whole point as well. It's really to try to work with local assets and what's already existing to strengthen it through ecosystem-based approaches and environmental conservation. So now so there's lots of different ways to approach and to NBSs, and it can really be implemented at different scales. It can be at the really local ecosystem level, looking at one single forest, one reef. It can be at the landscape or seascape level. That's most adapted. So you may be all familiar with reach to reef approaches. There's quite a few projects, really large projects ongoing at the moment in the region. So it's really working at the whole river level, for instance, or at a single coastline. You can also implement EBA as a whole of island approach, so really looking in an integrated manner. EBA can be implemented in urban settings, and there's also quite a few projects ongoing that often are implemented in combination with hard infrastructures. You can also start from specific target groups, for instance, working especially with women on livelihoods or traditional medicine, for instance, with youth or vulnerable populations. And there's also great momentum and great examples of motivated people in the region. And then finally, you can upscale it to really the higher planning level of provincial or national, and I get it in a bit more details later on how this relates to the NDCs and the national adaptation plans. And an important aspect that was also highlighted by both Amit and Ludo regarding, for instance, Fiji coastline adaptation projects is that oftentimes nature-based solutions or EBA are integrated within broader adaptation plans and interventions. So in combination with hard engineering structures, and this is called green-gray interventions or infrastructures. So I'll be going over a few examples from the PBAC project, the Pacific Ecosystem-Based Adaptation to Climate Change, that was implemented by SPRIP from 2015 to 2020 in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Fiji, and it was funded by the German government. And so the activity that I will be presenting will benefit from additional funding to support the further implementation of the EBA activities through the Kiwai initiative and the French Global Fund for the environment. So here you have an example of a local ecosystem intervention that was also in an urban setting. So it was about restoring Honiara Botanical Garden in the Solomon Islands. So the Honiara Botanical Garden is really the inner city forest, bringing a lot of shade, air and noise reduction in the city. And the Honiara's Rove Creek actually runs through the botanical garden. And so it was decided to first revive the Botanical Garden Management Committee that was that ceased to exist before that, and to strengthen and rehabilitate the garden. And this really provided resilience benefits to the city and to the whole river catchment through improved ecosystem health of downstream waterways and air quality. And it provided revenues from visitors, opportunities for public education, and it really improved, had positive outcomes for biodiversity by improving the connectivity between urban and natural habitats outside of the city. And it's so that's an example of urban adaptation at the local scale, the local ecosystem scale. I know there are also big urban projects going on that in the region, for instance, in Apia, that include ecosystem adaptation in their activities. But you can also work really at the river, for instance, level through reef-to-reef approaches. And that was done through the restoration and management of the Tagambe River in Port Vila, Vanuatu. And so really the project goal was the rehabilitation of the lower Tagambe River that goes through Port Vila and its marine and coastal zones to improve agricultural soil and water catchment health. It's really recognizing the importance of the forests as filters for the water. And all these actions were identified through prior assessments. So for this project, we've been using mostly the SRAM methodology, just mean environmental and socio-economic resilience assessment. So really looking at the environment and socio-economic contexts, future trends, and then in a participatory approach, decide on the major actions and priority areas that you want to target. And so some of the actions that were selected were to have river cleanups, the reforestation through the planting of endemic trees, of fruit trees and vetiver, mangrove restoration with the creation of a tree nursery. And really the aim of that, the resilience benefits that were looked after, was really to reduce soil erosion and to, with the trees, have more shade, and so reduce the sunlight, which then will help limit the growth of invasive aquatic plants in the water. And so in the end, just increasing the water quality for the inhabitants and strengthening the carbon storage from this forest and from this river catchment. Yeah, moving upscale again. It's an example from a whole of island approach that was implemented in Tavanui, Fiji. So it was really about addressing unsustainable farming and deforestation in the on the island that were causing soil degradation as well as degradation of watersheds. And so that was also impacting the incomes of farmers as it was becoming more and more difficult for them to grow and make a living out of their activities. So a very island-wide ecosystem-based adaptation master plan was developed through this SRAM methodology with the support from island leaders and the communities. And so the priority actions that were identified were the native forest protection and reforestation, as well as agroforestry. So a few model agroforestry farms were developed so that they could also initiate and raise awareness with other farmers on these issues. The establishment of tree nurseries for these forest, native forest, and for mangroves, for mangrove planting. And then down the stream to the coastline, there were some coral reef improvement through coral gardening activities. And through these actions, really trying to involve communities and youth with lots of awareness raising, the resilience benefits that were sought after where soil stabilization, looking at better income for farmers through increased soil quality, community health from restored water catchments, and to create new carbon sinks. So having both climate adaptation and climate mitigation benefits. And then another really key aspect I wanted to highlight for EBA and nature-based solutions in the Pacific, it's really the importance of having a gender responsive approach. And so it comes from the analysis that gendered roles and responsibilities influence people's vulnerability to climate change. So gender role, but also your role in society and vulnerable populations. And so, yeah, it's coming from the recognition that there will be different impacts according to gender, age, and your social status. But it's also recognizing the great leadership that we're seeing from Pacific Island women, for instance, leading on innovative adaptation projects that often build on traditional knowledge. And here I really wanted to highlight this intervention from Ada Akao. So Ada works for the network of indigenous people of the Solomon Islands. And she really captured the importance and the relevance of having a gender approach to EBA when in her intervention on Indigenous women's rights and environmental justice at the Global South Women Forum in 2021. And it was really to have the recognition of the vital role that Indigenous women play in local communities as preservers of biodiversity through their sustainable uses of resources, extensive knowledge of uses of plants, marine life as medicine, food and building materials. And those processes, programs, projects, and decision-making should be implemented in ways that are inclusive of women and girls by addressing all the various gender issues. So not even just looking at women and girls, but gender in general. And it's really about recognizing that there are gender differences in access to and control over natural resources, as well as gender-specific indigenous and traditional knowledge. And so not including this into your EBA option is really missing, potentially missing on a lot of important information. And it's also important in designing your governance arrangements when you're designing your EBA interventions, just to be aware of inequity issues and especially the unequal environmental decision-making, the unequal access to environmental decision-making processes. And there's just many benefits to a gender-responsive approach. First, it will contribute to other rights-based approaches objectives, such as reaching food security, reducing gender-based violence, etc. It increases effectiveness and sustainability by being more inclusive, more inclusive governance, increased equity and benefits from investments in EBA. And this also applies for social inclusion and vulnerable populations. So here, some key lessons learned from EBA interventions in the Pacific, lessons learned and sort of key success factors as well as challenges. So interventions should really be based on science and participatory research, including local and traditional knowledge. So it's really this community-based participatory approach, bringing together local knowledge and environmental science through prior assessments, including, of course, future trends, and identifying the drivers of degradation. It means it also relies on meaningful community engagement. And here I've placed a picture of the Pacific Invasive Battlers of the year 2021, just recognizing the awesome work that the Wallis and Futuna Department of Environment have done in a COVID context, so really by themselves, with resources and funding from the Protège project. And really with few resources, they've been able to remove invasive species, so plants or rats, from 14 inlets. And this, in reducing invasive species, is really key as well in strengthening the resilience of ecosystem services. And it's also part of, it also has adaptation benefits, and it really shows great community engagement. But it's also anyway essential to have a commitment to improve the environmental management from the local resource users or owners, trying to work as much as possible with local assets, education, awareness, and having champions. It's also great. It's especially important in the idea of really addressing the drivers of environmental degradation. Another key lessons learned is that it's really important to have participatory and spatial planning. That so really looking at the appropriate scale, having everyone around the table with actually meaningful consultations, establishing appropriate planning boundaries, and then factoring in other planning tools, for instance, including marine spatial planning that's been conducted previously, or integrated coastal zone management. Having effective governance arrangements is also key, recognizing, for instance, the unwritten roles and cultural nuances in government structure, which was underscored in many cases. That's really key to develop positive working relationships and to ensure equity as well and inclusive solutions are developed. Then it's just more about project management, but it's really about adaptive management at the suitable scale. So integrating local level governance systems and even, nested in the more broader national or local levels, trying to work multi-sector and to with the private sector, having also capacity building components and a sound monitoring and evaluation system. It's really important to have clear indicators, and part of the work that IUCN and others have been doing in defining indicators that can all be used in the region is that then it will help at the local scale in assessing the effectiveness of the solution and adapt management if necessary, but it will also help in strengthening the evidence base for ecosystem adaptation in the region. And then finally, since ecosystem adaptation usually needs more than just the usual project cycle timeframe, ideally 5 to 10 years to deliver fully, it's really key to have sustainable finance mechanisms. I think you'll have a whole module on accessing climate finance, but it really means that it's key to create incentives for communities and authorities to maintain the solutions in the long run, link with private sectors, or find innovative finance mechanism. Some of them were, for instance, payment for ecosystem services. I think you mentioned the RED Plus programs. It's something that is also explored in the world for low carbon ecosystems. A lot of principles, a bit challenging to develop sound ecosystem-based adaptation, but it's really the best practices that have been identified for successful adaptation processes. And so moving again from the local intervention to how can we scale it up nature-based solutions and mainstream them into policies. Nature-based solutions can also be already at the planning level. It's really into the whole concept. So here I'm quoting the International Institute for Environment and Development and IUCN. And they're saying that by placing people at the center, EBA involves community-based, led, and fully participatory approaches at the local level that then may be scaled up to the provincial and national levels to influence development planning and policy, and to multiply adaptation effects. And so here I've placed an example of obviously the beautiful Makwota province in Fiji, in the Lambata River estuary. So it was also an activity from the PBAC project that will be further supported through in its second phase by PBAC Plus with the Kiwa initiative funding. And so the whole point of the activity was to update and review the Makwota Natural Resource Management Strategy. And so it's really the first province level plan in Fiji, and it describes all the obviously very rich environmental assets of the province, but also highlights current and future status in relations to climate change, but also land uses. And so it lists costed actions that should address these sustainable practices, addressing responsibilities as well. So it's really multi-sectoral, multi-agency, and it has been developed by a participatory approaches with landowning communities and terrestrial and marine resource users. So yeah, EBA offers lots of opportunities to be included into multi-sectoral plans at different levels, provincial, national, but it's also a very flexible approach. That means that it can really build, as mentioned before, it can build on existing initiatives and create links between different planning levels. So I already mentioned MSP yesterday, it can be at the terrestrial water catchment levels as well. And so you don't have necessarily to have national big plans or and so there are many ways to integrate EBA into policies at the regional and national level. And I wanted to highlight how this can be directly integrated into the NDC processes. So in the Pacific, as you all know, GHG emissions are quite low even per capita. So a major part of the NDCs are the national adaptation plans. And actually in the technical guidance for national adaptation plan, it is really already identified that nature-based solutions should be included in all 4 phases of planning, meaning the identification, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and then throughout the whole adaptive management cycle. And so, yeah, the NAP process can really be an effective mechanism and driver for mainstreaming and upscaling EBA. A few entry points to do that will be that when developing adaptation options, considering economic, environmental, and social costs and benefits can really make the case for implementing EBA approaches, because they are often more cost effective, and there's also growing evidence in the region that they're often more efficient than hard infrastructures. You can also use a landscape or systems approach. So really finding different lenses to assess vulnerabilities and look at connectivities. And this can really help to identify ecosystems that are key providers of climate adaptation and climate regulation services. And so here I wanted to highlight what a very close neighbor, Timor-Leste, has been doing in its national adaptation plan. So really, Timor-Leste just submitted its NAP to the UNFCCC in 2021. And in this plan, really EBA is central, and there's a really a recognition of EBA being central for both climate change adaptation and for sustainable development, and so that it will also contribute to reaching the country's SDGs. The whole plan is based on science, sound environmental and socioeconomic assessments, vulnerability assessments at multiple levels that integrate local and traditional knowledge and experiences. And they were really ticking all the boxes and having a gender-based analysis included, as well as vulnerable populations provisions. It was really developed as a participatory community-based approach with customary role center. So in Timor-Leste, it's called Tara Bandu, and it's really a traditional decision-making process that really is embedded in EBA and in this national plan. And they've really constructed the plan as a mechanism to mainstream EBA at the subnational level. So really trying to engage and identify links between the different levels for resilience. And it's also a great mechanism to coordinate between all the international and national legal obligations and all this international framework. So they've used the National Adaptation Plan as a coordination mechanism to include their mitigation efforts toward the NDCs, but also their objectives in their national biodiversity strategy, as well as their Sendai disaster risk reduction strategies and action plans. And what's really interesting in this plan is that it also highlights the needs for long-term human and institutional capacity development. And that's not just at the government or public level, it's really also looking at the community, local community and vulnerable groups level, so that they are really empowered to implement effective ecosystem-based adaptation, but that they will be able to collect data to support regional adaptation planning. And so, yeah, feeding into this adaptive management process. And of course, they've added a climate conscious budgeting and financing plan that also includes the role of private sector's role. So yeah, that's an example of how you can really have national scale EBA planning, but you can also mainstream EBA throughout your sectoral planning, for instance, and yes, or in your national development strategies. That's also a great vehicle for EBA mainstreaming at the national level. And then moving up again the scale from national to regional, it's really key that nature-based solutions can really strive and be more efficient when they're done in collaboration. And so I started by, of course, mentioning that working with nature is not new, but now we really have this global framework that we can refer to. And although NDSs are very site-specific and at the local level, the whole nature-based solution framework helps to, well, aggregate, share lessons learned, aggregate indicators and results, and really to build a community of practice around NBS, and then creating momentum, having funding opportunities that are coming up. So there's also, we have a lot of hope and expecting the next UNEA meeting next month, where a resolution on nature-based solutions should be adopted. So it's to the United Nations Environmental Assembly next month. So yeah, it's a really good opportunity to build a community of practice around NDS, and thus to share lessons learned and best practices. And it can really be built into regional projects. And I wanted to highlight here the first QR-funded large regional project, that was the Organic Learning Farm Network, that aims to build the capacity and the resilience of smallholder producers in Fiji, Nauru, Solomon Islands, and Tonga. So this project is to create organic farms that would become learning centers on agroecology and agroforestry practices, with showcasing all the organic production methods and technologies. So really trying to learn from each other and to then spread into their communities this method and technologies and this expertise that will be developed through this project. And that's something that's already at play in the French OCDs, cooperation with the territories as well as key aspect of the QI initiative. And here you have a picture from the Protège project that's being implemented by SPC and SPRE in the French territories, and that's funded by the European Union. So here you have Biopacifica and Reetea showing the organic practices to a public. So yeah, it's really developing practices that can be shared with the rest of them and expertise that is available in the region, and share it with other practitioners. Working at the regional level, it's really important to strengthen the evidence base. So most of the interventions sadly are a bit young, so it's hard to see the benefits or the results yet. And even in the literature, there's still few examples from the Pacific. So working together with joint indicators will really help in strengthening the evidence base and make the case for ecosystem-based adaptation as a cost-effective and efficient approach. And then working together is also a great opportunity to find sustainable sources of funding, really counting on the next module as well to learn more on climate finance. And again, EBA will contribute to reach broader social goals. So for instance, towards the SDGs or regional goals, the framework for resilient Pacific or restoring coral reefs to reach our Pacific Coral Reef Action Plan objectives, contribute to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that's currently being negotiated, and to continue to work towards the objectives of the Pacific Island Framework for Nature Conservation and Protected Areas. So really some key takeaways from this presentation from NBS's tool for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Well, the first thing is that it's really about showing that NBS and EBA present opportunities for cost-effective approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And obviously, when planning with limited resources, this is a key element to take into account. But it's also important to realize that the restoration, regeneration, and protection of terrestrial and marine ecosystems actually support livelihoods, and that healthy ecosystems are the best defense against climate change impacts to livelihoods and health. Local and traditional ecological knowledge from different age and gender groups should really be integrated into adaptation efforts and planning, and more than integrated, it should also be supported and strengthened. But just on a very practical level, often adaptation strategies involve both green and gray interventions into hybrid solutions. As mentioned before, it takes a while for EBA, some EBA interventions, such as growing a mangrove forest, to actually bring results. And now with the urgency of climate change impacts, they often have to be included with hard engineering options. And then finally, obviously, while there are limits just to the capacity and the speed at which ecosystems can adapt to changing conditions, and same for people. And so ultimately, I would say I would just commend the great leadership from Pacific leaders and civil society in advocating for global GHG emission reductions. And I would just say that we all need to continue to flex for 1.5 for EBA to be effective. And yeah, here are the useful links and resources. And I think you'll all have my presentation after the meeting. So that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you
should
so
I stop
much.
sharing? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mathilde. Thank you for that presentation. I'll just recap quickly. on the ecosystem-based adaptations is a subset of nature-based solutions, and working with nature to adapt to climate change through strengthening biodiversity and ecosystems. It's great that you had touched on a lot of examples that was undertaken by the QA initiative. Restorations of the botanical garden in Solomon Islands, ridge to reef approach in Port Vila, and also the whole of the island approach in Taveuni. Very good examples of EBA adaptations. One of the main things as well is that thank you for touching on Mother Water Natural Resource Management Strategy. I am a product of Mother Water, so and Amit as well. So it is good that the water sanctuaries have financial benefits for the communities in terms of the generation trading of reeds and its use for meds. So this is one of the great examples of how EBA projects work for local communities. And I will quickly now move into the Q&A section. We have a lot of questions for you. First of all, we will start off with the questions from the chat. This was both from Chris, am I right, and Matil, on what is the difference between nature-based solutions and EBA.
Yes, thank you, Sadie. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and Ludovic presented on NBS as an umbrella concept. So it is about restoring or sustainable management of ecosystems with looking as well at social benefits. But NBS can have many different objectives. They can contribute specifically to food security and not just for climate change adaptation. And so EBA, ecosystem-based adaptation, and ecosystem-based approaches are a subset of NBS. So it's the same principle of having impact and strengthening ecosystems through restoration, management, or protection. But it's specifically for climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation.
Thank you, Mathilde. We have questions from our forms, from registration forms that we'd like to briefly touch on. And this is also from yesterday's training as well. The questions for funding opportunities for nature-based solutions to support biodiversity and elevating inundations of low-lying coastal areas.
Yeah, so I touched on that as well in the presentation, try to answer this. It's hard to alleviate from inundations through ecosystems services, so it's often hard infrastructures, and broader climate adaptation funding is available through the JEV or the GCF. The QA initiative is now here trying to fund specifically nature-based solutions that will support biodiversity. So yeah, I think a lot of that will be touched on during the next module. I'm also quite looking for it. So yes, thank you, Sadie.
Our next question is how to adopt and implement nature-based solutions to adaptation actions across relevant sectors, especially ministries.
Yeah, it's really challenging to mainstream EBA into relevant sectors planning. And the same for mainstreaming climate change, I guess, or other really transversal challenges. A good starting point would be to, when planning at the sector level, to have this ecosystem lens and to do environmental and socioeconomic assessments prior to identify really, well, just to open the door to ecosystem-based approaches. Often they are more cost effective. So that will be one way.
Thank you, Mathilde. Also, we have Vendo that wants to ask a question in French. I will let her formulate her message, her question. And I will, hopefully Roxanne will be able to interpret or pronounce them for me. Anyway, we'll move on to the next question. In the realm of fisheries, what are the main factors or opportunities to consider that will contribute to climate change adaptations?
So the impact of climate change on fisheries, changing water temperature will impact the biology of fishes. And so sometimes it limits their ability to grow and to reproduce. So it will probably lead to changes in species allocations, but also reduce the fish mass for really, that's also in coastal fisheries. But in the high seas, for instance, or tuna resources, they might be driven out of our economic zones, have different paths. And so being more sensitive, an easier target to overfishing on the high seas. But really what we see now on coastal fisheries and high seas fisheries is that it's mostly unsustainable fishing that is impacting the resource. And that's why EBA is also interesting, because it really tries to address the two, the unsustainable development drivers as well as climate change. And for adaptation, well, obviously fishing less and with less or fishing differently, because we know that, well, fish protein is a really major source of food and nutrition in the region. But if we're talking just in a livelihoods perspective as well, finding alternative sources of income could be another interesting adaptation option. And again, strengthening all the ecosystems that will strengthen the resource. For instance, all the mangroves or coral reefs that are really the nurseries to our coastal ecosystems. By strengthening them, you will also strengthen your fishing grounds. And then there's lots of traditional fishing methods that are really have proven. I'm thinking about the hahui in French Polynesia, just having seasonal closures on fishing efforts so that the resource has the time to renew itself. So that's some options for adaptation to climate change in the fisheries sector. And yeah, so there's a question in French. Should I?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mathilde. Just for the English speakers, you can also click on the interpretation and switch to English. I will now hand over to Van Tang to ask his question. Vinaka, over to you, Van.
Thank you. Merci. J'ai deux questions.
I have two questions. First, I don't fully understand how to integrate nature-based solutions into nationally determined contributions. How to mainstream those solutions in the indicators included in the NCDs. In New Caledonia, we have a very specific issue because New Caledonia's contribution to the NDC, the French NDC, is almost exclusively limited to energy. I have another question on funding. Are there funding mechanisms that specifically focus on nature-based solutions? As we heard yesterday, there are very precise criteria to assess the credibility or legitimacy of nature-based solutions projects. Merci. Thank you. I will answer in French. Thank you for your questions. With regards to the integration of nature-based solutions in NDCs, you have several methods that you can use. I use the example of UNDP. First, you need to calculate the quantity of carbon that can be stored by ecosystems. The example of mangroves is well known. So you can calculate the volume of CO2 that is stored by mangroves, and you can include it in your NCD. As we saw yesterday, a study showed that 100% of NDCs in the Pacific have an energy component, and very few NDCs have components for other sectors more relevant to the Pacific. All NDCs in the Pacific don't necessarily include nature-based adaptation. And the objective of EBA and NBS is mainly adaptation. National adaptation plans can include EBA. We have many guidelines and recommendations that help governments to include EBA in the NAPs. So this is not an obligation, but it can be a major component of national adaptation plans. It's food for thought. I hope that in the future, New Caledonia will be in a position to include EBA in those instruments. Of course, we need to make some trade-offs. We need to take into account the benefits related to carbon sinks and how it can be included in NDCs. So that's for your first question. I hope I answered your question. And secondly, as for funding mechanisms for nature-based solutions, I'm very happy that I represent the Kiwa initiative with my colleague Ludovic, and the Kiwa Initiative Secretariat is also attending the workshop. So I'd like to say that the Kiwa Initiative seeks to open funding opportunities for nature-based solutions for adaptation in the Pacific. There's a call for proposals that will close in 1 month on the 4th of April. Many projects have been submitted. I know that many of you are drafting proposals. And we also have opportunities for smaller projects with IUCN. Some projects will be funded by Australia and under bilateral arrangements in the region. With COP26 and all the pledges that were made at COP26, UNEA 3. Well, with all that, I hope that the Pacific will have more opportunities to pursue nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Mathilde. Hope that answers your question, Ben. Would also like to point out that for the NDCs, you can also have a revised NDC to include nature-based solutions, which can be done every 5 years. Just that the Regional NDC Hub helps with countries on that. Thank you, Mathilde. I think that's all the questions. Is there any other questions on the floor or in the chat group? I guess silence is king, as like Wanda likes to say. So I will now move on to our next section, and thank you very much, Mathilde, for that great presentation. Our next item on the agenda is our photos. So hopefully everyone has got their makeup on and looking very good. I know it's the middle of the day. So would you please put on your cameras? Would I like to ask Stephanie or Roxanne to be able to take a photo? And please let me know if you've done this as well. Is everybody on? Oh, nice to see everybody's faces. Bula Vanda. I guess we should have done this before.
Great job. Well done.
All right, pause everybody, beautiful smiles. Stephanie, are we good? Okay, one more, sorry. I know you have tight muscles, but you know. All right, done. Thank you so much for holding that pose. Vinaka, Malo. Now we would like to hand over the floor to Jack, who will now take us through out to our break rooms. So over to you, Jack. Vinaka. Sorry, Jack, you're on mute.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
fantastic. Thank you very much. So yes, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining today, and thank you to Mathilde for the fantastic presentation already had this morning. So yes, to introduce myself, my name's Jack Rossiter. I work with SPC in the Climate Finance Unit. Specifically focusing on accessing climate finance through the multilateral funds, so the GCF and Adaptation Fund specifically. So today we're going to run through two presentations on access to climate finance and nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. So for the first presentation, I'd like to begin, and that will be related to an overview of climate change projects from a financing perspective. So with that, we'll break this down into two sections. The first will be on how does global multilateral climate finance work, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Dirk Snijman for a follow-up section on funding modalities specifically under the Green Climate Fund. So to start with, I will just focus on an overview of the climate finance landscape. So under the UNFCCC, the definition of climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public or private sources of funding that seek to support mitigation and adaptation actions that address climate change. So what I'm presenting on the screen here is what appears to be quite a complex sort of arrangement of different financial flows. But this is just to highlight that the broader term of climate finance is quite large, but this includes all public and private flows of finance from developed nations, as well as from developed nations and all countries into specific mitigation and adaptation actions. However, what I'd like to focus on today more specifically is related to the multilateral climate funds. So these are the specific funds set up to finance climate adaptation and mitigation. And they specifically focus on the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the GEF. Sorry, we will focus on the Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and GEF for this presentation. But what I would like to highlight here is if you look at the other two darker circles there, MDB finance relates to multilateral development bank financing, and ODA, official development assistance channels. So with relation to MDB finance, this relates to the financial flows that come out of the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, IFAD, and other related IFIs, and ODA is the specific climate financing that comes out of country contributions to climate change. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide. So here I'll give an overview of the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, and specifically go through some aspects of accessing the money resources through the GEF. So just to highlight first off that the Global Environment Facility is a wider ranging sort of environmental facility. So this focuses on 6 broad focal areas. So those include biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change, forests, international waters, and land degradation. So just to highlight basically here that it's a fund that also goes beyond just climate change and more onto environmental matters. With that, I just want to highlight that the GEF has been around for the longest out of the 3 funds that we'll specifically focus on today. It was set up in 1991 and has therefore programmed to date $21.7 million to date over 2,300 projects approved. So it's got quite a large range of experience in financing climate adaptation and mitigation action, as well as on biodiversity and the other focal areas. So with that, the GEF is moving into a new replenishment cycle. So they run on 4-year cycles. So we're moving into the GEF 8. And it's expected that GEF 8 will roughly replenish about $5 to $6.5 billion US. And from this allocation, there will be a system of transparent allocation of resources to each individual country. So this is what's known as the STAR allocation that will be generated to each individual country. So the STAR allocations specifically for small island developing states are expected to be announced in July 2022. So that the resources available specifically for small island developing states, and therefore, a big relevance to the Pacific region, should be announced in July. I just want to focus here as well, just to show that there is a large, direction under the GEF to target nature-based solution proposals, and also focusing on where they've got a high mitigation potential. So I will talk a bit about that more in detail a bit later on. And also it is possible to go for multifocal area proposals, and these are encouraged under the GEF. So instead of just focusing on one of the 6 focal areas before, you can cross-cut between the focal areas. I also just want to mention that there are impact programs under the GEF. These are set up to enhance learning and knowledge sharing between projects and institutions that are focusing on the same sectors or technical areas. And just to highlight, under GEF 8, they will be opening up new impact programs, and specifically those that relate to the Pacific and may be of interest are blue economies and healthy oceans, blue and green islands, circular solutions to plastic pollution, landscape restoration, food systems, and green infrastructure. So with that, I want to just go into a specific case study to highlight how GEF financing can be utilized to fund nature-based solution approaches and what those outcomes can be and how they would specifically relate to NDCs. So just to try and show a practical use of GEF financing to contribute to the NDCs and to focus on MBS approaches. So an example that I want to focus on here is in Fiji on a GEF project that's specifically related to strengthening marine protected areas and locally managed marine areas. This is a single focal area project, and it was actually under the biodiversity focal area. So this is to highlight that even under GEF financing, you can target a biodiversity focal area. Even though it's not climate change, it can still contribute to the NDCs. So here, I just want to highlight that the approach of the project from a nature-based solutions approach would be to focus on ecosystem-based management. So out of those 5 input categories into MBS that Ludo presented yesterday, this would focus on ecosystem-based management. So the approach of this project specifically is to create a national framework for marine protected areas, to enhance provincial locally managed marine area networks, and to foster learning, knowledge sharing, communication and M&E across the country to better link and enhance the lessons learned from establishing these networks and frameworks. So through this approach, marine protected areas and LMMAs have been set up in coastal areas to focus specifically on coastal reef and ecosystem rehabilitation. So by reducing fishing pressure and allowing the reefs and ecosystems to naturally regenerate and increase their habitats. So the nature-based solution output in this case split between the 2 specific outputs. So just remembering that MBS should have biodiversity outputs, but also societal benefits. So from a biodiversity perspective, the project would lead to improved habitat health with less pressure on the reef and allowing for regeneration of better regeneration of corals and seagrass meadows, etc., without, with reduced boat traffic and certain other activities that may damage physical structures in the coastal areas. So with improved habitat health becomes increased nursery output. So fishery nurseries that are, protected under, within reefs or mangrove or seagrass ecosystems would then be able to proliferate without too much external pressures from fishing activity. And this would lead to an increase in species diversity and abundance of fish. So from a societal perspective, this leads to overcoming food security. So by providing greater access to fish resources and with the increased abundance that I previously mentioned, and therefore also leading to increased economic outcomes for the fishery, for local fishing sectors, and also greater resource equity through the locally managed marine areas. This would allow for improved governance and equitable rights for fishing access in the managed areas. So how this would relate to an NDC is specific to adaptation in this case. So under Fiji's nationally determine contributions, they do have specific adaptation contributions. So in this case, focusing on an increase in marine protected areas and also to conserving natural environment and biodiversity. So through that, it's a pretty high level approach to just highlighting how a GEF resources can be utilized under an NBS approach to directly target specific NDCs and show both biodiversity and societal outcomes. So with that, I would just I'll move on to the next, but one additional piece of information that I just want to mention with the GEF is that the GEF as a multilateral climate fund under the UNFCCC is only accessible to non-Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC conventions. So with that, I'll move on to the next fund, which is the Adaptation Fund. So through this slide, I just want to highlight that the Adaptation Fund is specifically focused on focusing on adaptation for action, specifically concrete climate adaptation action. And they like to see a focus on learning and sharing that can then build into future projects to enhance the impact of scaled up projects. So under this, they've got a specific focus on engaging and empowering vulnerable communities and social groups, advancing gender equality and empowering women and girls, so building that into the climate adaptation approaches, and also strengthening long-term institutional and technical capacities. And through the learning and sharing aspects, they do want to see complementarity and cohesion and coordination with other climate finance delivery channels. So for example, linking into, with previous GEF projects or linking to future GCF projects that might like to scale up an intervention that has been undertaken under the Adaptation Fund. So a brief overview. So the Adaptation Fund is a little bit newer than the GEF. So far, it has allocated $850 million, of which only 48 million have been allocated to Pacific countries. So this highlights that there is an underrepresentation of Pacific countries under the Adaptation Fund financing at the moment. So again, out of 124 projects approved, only 9 of those have been in the Pacific to date. So unlike the GEF, they do have an annual replenishment cycle. And as of in 2021, this did take a large markup from the 2020 and 2019 replenishments to boost it almost double to 356 million for the year. Here, I just want to highlight there is a country cap for accessing Adaptation Fund resources. This is set at 20 million per country. This was recently increased from 10 million. But there is a limit on the maximum size that a single project can access, which is $10 million US. So with that, just a quick overview to focus of the focus of the Adaptation Fund is to focus on countries and communities that are most vulnerable to climate change, and they must align with national development strategies. So here it is crucial that Adaptation Fund projects do focus on NDCs and national adaptation plans. So they do want to see close alignment with the country goals and strategies related to adaptation and climate. And they do like to see a holistic approach that incorporates economic, social, and environmental benefits as well, to show high cost effectiveness to ensure that their resources are being used the best possible means for highest impact. There are 8 impact areas, outcome areas under the GCF, under the Adaptation Fund, to focus on reducing exposure of climate hazards, institutional capacity building, raising awareness and ownership of climate change risk, adaptive capacity of the development sector services and infrastructure, ecosystem services and resilience, diversified local livelihoods and source of income, policy and regulation, and innovation. So with that, again, I'd like to dip into a specific case study, and for this I've chosen a concept note that is currently under development, focusing in Papua New Guinea. So I've changed the focus of this slightly, so moving away from coastal fisheries resources to small-scale agriculture. So yeah, the project focuses on improved food security and building the resilience of communities in Papua New Guinea to climate change. So again, from the nature-based solutions input, this focuses on 2 of the 5 inputs that are sort of eligible under NBS approaches. So this is ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem restoration. So the approach of the project is quite complex, but what I'd like to focus on is component 1 of the project, which looks at climate proofing small-scale agricultural production. So under this component, climate resilient crop varieties will be investigated and expanded and upscaled to greater disbursement at the farm level. So there's greater utilization of specific species that are resilient to the impacts of climate change, whether that is drought resilient rice that is able to cope with high heat temperatures and drought conditions, or in certain areas where flood risk is quite high, even flood resistant rice species can be utilized. A second output within the component would be to focus on awareness raising and capacity building of climate resilient agricultural processes. So setting up farmer field schools to disseminate climate knowledge on resilient agricultural practices and good ecosystem-based restoration or adaptation activities. And then the third output would be focused on reforestation, and specifically looking at reforesting 3,000 hectares of degraded habitat that will allow for the recreation of vegetation on degraded slopes to knit together soils and increase soil health and biodiversity to prevent on steep sloping areas to prevent soil runoff and further degradation of the land. So this will also enable for greater infiltration of water resources in watersheds and prevent sheet erosion and loss of water. So it will allow for greater water provisioning and regulation ecosystem services that can then filter into the agricultural systems downstream. So it provides effectively more resources under the ecosystem services for agriculture. So from the NBS outputs, so focusing on biodiversity, again, this would look at improved habitat health. So the reforestation and use of more friendly climate resilient agricultural processes that don't degrade the land would lead to increased floral habitats, and which would then in turn lead to greater pollinator proliferation and soil biodiversity increases, which will have benefits for agriculture, which would lead to greater agricultural outputs, which has societal benefits of increasing food and water security. And through increased production as well would lead to greater profitability on farm levels, and therefore improved economic outcomes for local populations and beneficiaries. So the specific NDCs for PNG that this would target would be a 10% population with increased food and water security from an adaptation perspective, and on mitigation. This would lead to a reduction in deforestation and improved and enhanced carbon sequestration through the reforestation of the 3,000 hectares of degraded land, of degraded habitat. So from this, you can see the direct links of the NBS to the NDCs. And here, just to highlight that the Adaptation Fund is only eligible for countries under the Kyoto Protocol. So with that, I would like to move on to the GCF. So I've saved the Green Climate Fund for last, as this will lead into Dirk's presentation that follows mine. This is the largest and newest of the three funds, and focuses specifically not only on adaptation, but also on mitigation specific impacts. So they do have 8 results areas that are split between mitigation and adaptation. So under mitigation, they look at energy generation and access, so looking for renewable energy technologies and clean energy, forests and land use systems, greening buildings, cities, industries and appliances, and also greening the transport sector. Whereas under adaptation, they focus on health, food and water security, ecosystems and ecosystem services, infrastructure and the built environment, and livelihoods of people and communities. So yep, just to highlight, they are the largest of the funds. So they so far have programmed 10 billion to date, although this isn't as much as the GEF in the total pot. It has been in a much shorter time. And so this has been since in about half the time that the GCF was established in 2010, and has so far developed 190 projects. Again, there is a underrepresentation in the Pacific region, with only 16 projects approved to date, totaling 456 million. So with that, the GCF do want to see a focus on SIDS, so that we're a very high priority, and specifically in the Pacific. So there is a large opportunity under the GCF to increase financial flows for climate adaptation and mitigation. So just to highlight that we have recently entered into the first replenishment cycle of the GCF, which will run from 2020 to 2023. And again, this was roughly 10 billion, so it was 9.7 billion was confirmed. And just to highlight that there is no country cap under the GCF, so projects can target as many resources as is eligible under the accreditation standards of the lead accredited entity taking the project forward, and there can be as many projects as you wish within reason. Although, excuse me. So the focus of the GCF, they do want to see a 50-50 split of adaptation versus mitigation projects. To date, they have shown that the portfolio does have a high mitigation focus. So there is definitely a willingness from the GCF to look more closely at adaptation fund projects, and a willingness to approve more adaptation-based approaches. Again, as with the other two funds, they do look to support countries to realize their NDCs and national adaptation plans, and they must be closely aligned with all country strategies on climate. So there should be high country ownership. And yeah, so high country lead in programming, and there's also a high priority for direct access entities to take projects forward, which Dirk will highlight the direct access entity modality in the next section. The investment criteria of the GCF focuses on impact potential, paradigm shift, potential, sustainable development, needs of the recipient, country ownership, efficiency and effectiveness, which we can touch on a little bit later as well. So for the case study of the GCF, my apologies, I've decided not to show a Pacific specific example, but I have chosen what I think is a very relevant GCF program that can highlight how the GCF can be used to take projects and programs to scale and focus on coastal issues and rehabilitation. So with that, I wanted to just focus on GCF approved projects in West Africa that is focusing on three countries, so South Africa, Mozambique and Tanzania, so covering a large area of coastline of Africa, and this is called the Blue Action Fund, and really takes GCF to financing to have impact at scale. So just to highlight this, the MBS input covers four out of the 5 approaches there. So ecosystem management, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem protection, and ecosystem restoration. So the approach of this program is to actually to set up specific financing windows to fund on the one hand, protection and sustainable management of coastal resources, so to protect and sustain through management practices, and also to focus on rehabilitation of degraded coastal ecosystems. So this is also looking at a very holistic approach and looking at, establishment of protected areas, local management, local marine managed areas, as well as specific rehabilitation physical processes such as mangrove restoration, coral restoration, and seagrass restoration. So it is a real combined approach to provide large impacts for the marine ecosystems. So from the MBS outputs perspective, the biodiversity aspects are improved and rehabilitated habitats, increased nursery outputs, as I've mentioned before, and increased species diversity. But what is great about this program, being a regional or sub-regional approach, it leads to greater coordination between countries and better linking up of the marine protected area network. So there's real wider thinking and integration across the region. To lead to better thinking and lessons learned and knowledge sharing to really maximize impact. So this ties in nicely to the societal outputs, which would be food security, increased economic outputs from increased fisheries, and also disaster risk reduction through the protection of coastal areas with mangroves, so reducing the impact of storm surges, etc., and also resource equity through the management and governance at local areas. So this directly ties into the NDCs yet again. So looking at from an adaptation perspective, MPA increase coastal rehabilitation, increase marine resources, and fishery resilience. So these are some of the key adaptation NDCs from the 3 countries that I have mentioned. And also the mitigation aspects there under NDCs on carbon sequestration. So through the rehabilitation of mangroves and seagrass meadows, as Mathilde mentioned, there can be quite a large sort of blue carbon output from that. Carbon sequestration from those approaches. So with that, I'll finish off the case study there. Again, at quite a high level, but happy to take any questions at the end. And just to highlight here as well that the Green Climate Fund is also only eligible to 2 countries under non-Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC. So with that, I just wanted to touch on the Kiwa initiative. I won't go into detail here, but as it's already been covered in far more detail by Ludo and Mathilde, but just to focus that this is a Pacific-specific nature-based solutions fund and is eligible to all Pacific, or to the 19 Pacific island countries and territories. So this does include those countries, territories, that aren't potentially under the Kyoto Protocol or non-Annex 1 countries to the UNFCCC, and allows specific funding to those territories. And beyond that, there's also options through the MDBs that I had mentioned previously, the IFIs such as World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other MDBs to access funding, as well as the EU for territories that might not fall under the criteria for the 3 funds I've just mentioned. So with that, I just wanted to round off by highlighting the advantages of multilateral climate finance. So the first thing is that there's a very high country ownership. It has to be justifications need to be strongly made and that they align with country strategies, and that strong national consultation has been taken in the process, and also that no objection or endorsement from the designated authorities of each country must be provided prior to a project being approved by the relevant approval authorities of the funds. So it is country driven. The funds do provide quite large scale funding, so it's able to take climate action to scale. As mentioned, it's directly linked to national designated contributions and national adaptation plans. They do provide grant modalities, so specifically for adaptation, loan resources are not always quite appropriate or the best option to finance adaptation projects. So grants are available from these funds, and are specifically the main modalities of the Adaptation Fund and the GEF to really focus in on climate adaptation and hit that impact, and also allow for innovation in the sectors. They provide economic, social, and environmental co-benefits. You're able to channel resources directly to beneficiaries. It promotes innovation and learning, and also it can tie in with the private sector, utilizing these resources to blend with private sector financing to de-risk investments. So with that, I will stop there, but one thing I do want to highlight is that we have included a key parameters of the GEF and GCF and Adaptation Fund summary table for your reference after the presentation, so that you can see the key modalities and parameters of the three funds in a little bit more detail. So just to highlight those. And with that, I would like to stop there and hand over to my colleague, Dirk Snyman, to take you through the next section of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Just busy setting the presentation up to take over. All right, is that clear to everyone?
Yes, Dirk.
Okay, great, thanks. Yes, so as Jack said, we have these three global multilateral funds under the UNFCCC. Of course, there are lots of other options, including for territories. There's national funding. There's all types of ways in which mitigation and adaptation, NBS and NDCs can be supported. We have chosen to focus on the GCF for the next part of the presentations, just because it's the largest one, has larger opportunities. It's also has adaptation and mitigation. And it's also sort of the flavor of the month or of the year, let's say. But we want to stress that a lot of these processes are similar for all of the funds. And so particularly the second part of the session, when we try to be a little bit practical at how to formulate a project proposal, that is something that works for Green Climate Fund, for Adaptation Fund, for GEF, and indeed for almost any funding opportunity. Even if you're trying to motivate from national government a budget for some kind of project, using the same approach, the same rationale, and the same logic works across the board. But okay, to look at the Green Climate Fund itself, how it works is that you have engagement between the Green Climate Fund, accredited entities, and national designated authorities. And so the national designated authority, that's the focal point in the government, and any project eventually must be approved by the national designated authority. So whether it's a project coming from agriculture under the Ministry of Agriculture, or fisheries under the Ministry of Fisheries, depending on how your government is set up, eventually it goes through the national designated authority and they will approve the project from the country government level. And that's whether the country ownership is really important for any project. And also we've highlighted the country programs, Green Climate Fund country programs, where a country lays out its priorities. The other key is the accredited entity. And so these act as an intermediary between the Green Climate Fund and the national government, and facilitate the transfer of funds and also facilitate the oversight of specific projects. So there are various categories. The first one is international access entities. So those are such as the UN agencies, the multilateral development banks. But then Jack mentioned the direct access entities, and this is, I think, where it's really important for the Pacific. So we have some regional direct access entities. SPC and SPREP, who are both here, are direct access entities across the region, Micronesia Conservation Trust as well. And these are important because we feel that as regional entities, we are closer to countries and have better understanding of country needs, perhaps than international entities that maybe, have their headquarters 10 time zones away and might not be as aware of what country priorities are and what is important in the Pacific. But then even better than that, we have national direct access entities. And so, for example, Fiji Development Bank and also the Ministry of Finance and Economic Management in the Cook Islands are accredited to the Green Climate Fund in a similar way to what SPREP and SPC are, and in a similar way to what UN agencies are accredited. And obviously, they would have the best understanding of the country context, of the priorities, and what is needed. And so, essentially how it works between the three, the Green Climate Fund, the National Designated Authority, and the accredited entity, is that the NDA and the AE would work together on a project proposal, a project idea, submit that to the Green Climate Fund, and then if or when that is approved, they would then work together on the implementation of that project. We'll look later on how to go about setting up a project. But just for now, to identify the types of support to members, the first one is called readiness support, and that's essentially helping countries to be ready to access climate finance. It can be large amounts of money, particularly when it's coming through direct access entities. Countries may not be used to managing these types of projects. It's different to traditional ODA and other forms of bilateral funding. And so this is around strengthening countries' preparedness to be able to handle Green Climate Fund. So the area can be for capacity building, it can be for improving planning for adaptation or mitigation, it can be for expanding your pipeline, so developing project ideas, or putting into place frameworks and policies to be able to manage climate change projects better. This readiness is up to 1 million per country per year that is allocated. It doesn't have to be used in that 1 year, it can stretch over several years. And then there's also a special window of 3 million per country for improving their adaptation planning process, developing a plan and developing mechanisms for that. And perhaps really key to stress here, everyone is interested in national direct access entities because that's where, as we said, the local action with local knowledge, local management needs to take place. And under this readiness support, this is one avenue where a national direct access entity could be established and could be strengthened and have their systems put in place to be able to manage GCF projects. So if you're interested in a national direct access entity, this readiness support is of interest. But then we look at the main idea of the Green Climate Fund, which is obviously actual projects. So not just the capacity building of something like the readiness, but doing actual work on the ground. So Jack has discussed how there is a split between mitigation and adaptation, and there's a priority for SIDS, least developed countries, and African countries. And obviously this is where it becomes of interest to us. How and what type of projects can we get? So just to, if you look at the size of projects, they go from small, micro, which is less than 10 million, to small, which is between 10 or let's say up to 50 million. Medium is up to 250 million, and then large is larger than 250 million. So these are quite big opportunities. SPREP and SPC, as two examples, are accredited at two different levels. So SPREP is accredited up to projects of 250 million, whereas SPC is accredited up to 50 million. And so these accreditations are just based on the capacity of an organization and their track record and the size of project that they'd be expected to manage. So generally, you know, the World Banks and the Asian development banks, they would be the large institutions handling large projects of above 250 million. It may be that national direct access entities would be in the micro category when they are perhaps do not have the systems to handle more than 10 million. Looking to the top right, environmental and social risks as well. This is again depending on what type of activity the accredited entity can handle and what type of activities would be under the project. So in this case, both SPREP and SPC are accredited up to category B, which is medium risk. Fortunately, nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, that would generally fall into category C for minimal risks. And so even where it may be a small national direct access entity that's only accredited to $10 million and for category C, I think there's still a lot of potential for nature-based solutions there to be able to be providing those local level impacts. And then, as Jack said as well, there are a variety of mechanisms in which the Green Climate Fund provides support. It could be through loans or equities or guarantees. But particularly for NDCs, the grants category is of interest. Again, this is where SPREP and SPC are both accredited to grants, just as an example. But the Fiji Development Bank is an example of a Pacific national direct access entity that is accredited for loans. So depending on the type of the project, the risk category, whether you prefer grants or loans for the project, the size, then you would select a direct access entity or an accredited entity to work with. So having looked at that, we will have a look at the types of projects that there are. Just starting with the smallest one. For up to $10 million and for minimum environmental and social risks, so category C, you can go through the simplified approval process. So this is where the process, as it explains, is simpler. It's a little bit more streamlined. It's a little bit shorter than the full project proposal process. And it's particularly for projects that are ready for scaling up. And so this is a good advantage. We think that if you have an NBS project that has been proven, maybe through previous initiatives or maybe at a small scale through a smaller grant, and it's ready for action, ready to scale up to $10 million to a larger project, and it's nature-based solutions, so it's got minimal environmental risks and impacts, then this could be a good opportunity to take advantage of the simplified process. It's essentially a fast track, an attempt at a fast track process, although we have to warn, and Jack will go into this a bit later again, GCF processes usually take a lot of time and a lot of effort anyway, even the so-called simplified processes. But let's say you want more than 10 million, or it's maybe a category B or higher environmental risks, then you will go to what is officially known as the project approval process, but it's basically just a normal or full-sized project. So that's for any project above 10 million, or any project with environmental and social safeguards category A, B, or C. It's got a much larger set of documentation, more annexes, and takes a bit longer than the simplified process. but offers then that greater flexibility that you can take on more and different types of project activities. So this would also be for if you have a multi-country or a regional project covering a few countries, then it would probably exceed that $10 million category, and you would go for a small or medium project under one of these these regular size project approaches. Then the other categories that another category that we think is of particular interest is a pilot program called Enhancing Direct Access. We think this is a great approach, particularly for Pacific countries, and essentially what this process entails is on granting. So this is where the accredited entity and the NDA together apply to the Green Climate Fund for a large amount of money, but then makes that available through smaller grants, so sub-grants or on-granting for individual sub-projects within the country. So this allows for local government or local authorities or even local communities to be making decisions in the sub-projects, in the sub-grants, on what their priorities and their adaptation actions could be. So, for example, you'd apply for a large, let's say, $15 million grant from the Green Climate Fund for, let's say, nature-based solutions or for food security. And then when that is approved, that would be broken up into smaller grants, let's say 50,000 or 100,000 or even larger, $500,000 grants, sub-grants or sub-projects that can go for specific actions, perhaps in different areas, perhaps on different islands where atolls maybe need a different approach to volcanic islands. So you can have different sub-projects under that for different types of environments. Perhaps you want one on coastal fisheries in one area, but another one you want agriculture, some type of agriculture intervention. So there's a lot of country ownership, there's a lot of local decision-making, local involvement, local management, local prioritization, and a lot more flexibility. And so we think this could be a good approach for the Pacific, where areas, countries are so widespread in terms of dispersal of islands across huge areas. You can really have that local level action taking place. Finally, the GCF's private sector facility. This is a special facility as well, where the GCF is trying to bring in more private sector actions, private sector entities into the funding of adaptation and mitigation actions. And there was a little bit of discussion earlier about sustainability of interventions and sustainability of actions and projects. And this is where the private sector could play a key role in providing funding after projects have been completed. So after a project life cycle, involvement of the private sector is a key way that that ongoing sustainability, particularly financial sustainability, could be achieved. This is the last slide for this section, and then we'll have, perhaps I'll suggest a short break before we go into the break, into the second part of the session. But we just wanted to discuss how GCF has the mindset of a banker, an investment bank or a multilateral development bank, but their return on investment looks a little bit different. And we think this is key to understand when developing projects for, let's say, nature-based solutions or let's say renewable energy. As a financial mechanism to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Green Climate Fund is mandated to deliver climate results. That's obviously quite logical. And so they track their results across their whole portfolio to to look at their contributions to global targets and commitments for different agreements, such as sustainable development goals, such as the nationally determined contributions, such as the Paris Agreement. And so in those focal areas that Jack mentioned, whether it's water security, whether it's resilient infrastructure, whether it's mitigation in the area of transport, GCF approves projects then based on what those contributions will be to those different results areas, which feed up into global commitments. So whether it's individual national commitments or how those aggregate into something like the Paris Agreement. And so that is the return on investment, if you want to call it that the Green Climate Fund is looking for. They look at whether projects are economically and financially sustainable, whether there is, the return on investment doesn't have to be in terms of money, like a traditional banker always wants to see the return on investment in terms of how many dollars will you make per dollar invested. In this case, the GCF is looking at adaptation or mitigation return of investment. How many lives will be saved from disasters? How many climate resilient, ecosystem restoration initiatives will they see? How many hectares? How many greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced per dollar of investment? So their return on investment is measured in terms of adaptation or mitigation benefits. And the advantage of this is that it also enables the countries to track progress on their NDCs. If you have a GCF project that addresses a certain NDC, then obviously the results from that project contribute to your achievement of your NDC, and you can track that. And it also allows evidence-based climate finance targets. So looking at what does climate finance result in? What is the evidence? What is the proof that climate finance achieves in terms of benefits? And then allowing to rework that into future targets. I'm pretty sure that's my last slide for this section. Yes. So I will stop there. Thanks very much. Maybe if we take a few minutes for questions and then a comfort break, I could stretch my legs for a few minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Dirk. Yes, we will do that. So first we'll jump right into the Q&A, and then straight after that, then we can take a 5 minutes break so everyone can grab a coffee or water. So there's a few questions. I hope, Satya, that Jack has able to answer your question from the chat. And we will jump into the first question from yesterday, if you don't mind. And that is on the, it'll be interesting to learn how the programs will be able to support people with disabilities and climate change. So Jack or Dirk?
Thanks. Seeing as I'm still on screen, I'll probably take these, and then if Jack wants to correct me, he can jump in. Certainly for Green Climate Fund, GEF, and Adaptation Fund projects, they have a strong focus on gender and social inclusion for different vulnerable groups, including groups with disabilities, obviously, but they have very strong policies, very strong scrutiny, very strong focus on vulnerable groups and how indigenous peoples as well, and how a project can specifically target their adaptation or resilience needs. And so we know that different groups of people, particularly, for example, people with disabilities, maybe have different priorities to what other people might have. And so you're expected in a project to look at a certain climate change impact, let's say flooding, and how will that affect different groups? How will it affect farmers? How will it affect fisher people? But also how will it affect men and women differently? How will it affect young and old people differently? How will it affect people with disabilities differently? And then you design your activities around that.
Thank you, Dirk. The next question is from Shalvin. For GCF, suppose the accredited entity is not entitled to one grant, what could be some workarounds?
Sorry, I just lost the screen for a second. So the workarounds are a bit difficult in that case. The one option is to go for a different accredited entity that is accredited for on granting. GCF is unfortunately quite strict about how how accredited entities take action within their accreditation framework. So, you know, SPC or SPREP can't be giving out loans when we're not accredited for that. And similarly, if someone is not accredited for on granting, then they won't be able to do that. So the simplest solution is a different accredited entity. Otherwise, you know, there's a way you could, for example, combine you know, grants with alternative sources, let's say from bilateral funds. So do a green climate fund project that's also combined with bilateral support, you know, let's say from another government that's offering direct bilateral support and that does permit the on granting. And so blending two different kinds of projects or two different kinds of approaches together. Thanks.
Thank you, Dec. I just have a question just for clarification, if you don't mind, Dec. I know you touched on FDB as one of the loaning institute for GCF. And knowing that Fiji Development Bank is locally for Fiji, do they allow also to expand their loans to other countries? Or do other development banks in each of these countries would be allowed to access the GCF to be able to do a similar grants that is being done by FDB?
Thank you. Yeah, maybe, you know, as an example, I can use the fact that FSM Development Bank is now also working or starting to work on the feasibility of their accreditation to the Green Climate Fund. So unfortunately, for the Fiji Development Bank, they could only work on as a national direct access entity. They could only work within Fiji, but there are opportunities of working with regional development banks for on granting. Sorry, for the loan types of activities in other countries. So with ADB or World Bank, for example. But yeah, unfortunately, those national entities are restricted to those countries.
Thank you so much, Dec. Fernandez, did you want to ask a question or? Or did you have an accident with the mic? Do we have any other questions on the chat team?
Yeah, I think there was just a follow-up question, Sadie, from Satya, related to a discussion going on in the chat. She asked, based on presentations from yesterday and to now, interventions have to align with internationally accepted NBS principles for funding. Your comments on regionally accepted NBS principles. So related to this, I wouldn't say that necessarily that the funding has to be focused on internationally accepted principles of NBS, rather that the funding allocations would be based on what is most suitable in the local context. So the approaches would fall within those broader ecosystem approaches, and then the specific activities under the NBS would be tailored at the local context. So yeah, in the design approach, it would be, you would list the activities under NBS that you would like to go forward with and justify it from the local context. So I think it would be fine to have regional acceptable principles of NBS as long as they're accompanied with the strong justification in the applications. I'll stop there. Maybe you know, if Dirk, Ludo, or Mathilde have anything to add to that, then please jump in.
Thank you, Jack. Satya, I hope that answers your queries. With no other questions, we can take a 5 minutes break. So it's 11:27 Fiji time. So be back by 11:30. Let's take 11:35, be back again. Naka. Everyone is back to the room. We'll give a minute for everyone to be back in. But I will hand over to Jack, who will now take us through to the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sadie. So please let me know that you can see my screen
Yes.
and that yeah, sounds like you can hear me this time, which is great. Fantastic. So shall I jump in, Sadie, or are we waiting for an extra minute? Happy to jump in.
Yep, I guess so. We've got time.
Okay.
Not to our advantage. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yep, so hi again, everyone. So I will present the second half of the presentation. So this will be on GCF proposal development. So as Dirk mentioned, we're deciding to focus on the GCF for our example Today, being the largest fund and with the most robust and rigorous standards, it's sort of the gold standard example to highlight for robust climate adaptation and mitigation projects. So with that, the presentation will be broken down into three parts. So focusing first on the project development process and project cycle of the GCF. Then looking at key requirements to develop a concept note, and specifically then looking at the theory of change process for GCF and how they like to see the theory of change and the logic and climate rationale built into their projects. From there, we'll then break out into individual breakout rooms for a group exercise where we'll go through the theory of change processes to come up with a rough theory of change for a conceptual project. And as of with yesterday's poll question, you guys have indicated which groups you'd like to be assigned to, and we can touch on that as we get to the group exercise. So, yep, with that, I'll move in to the first section. So just to highlight here through this cartoon that yeah, the GCF process and also with the in general climate finance process is a highly technical process that requires a lot of justification and supporting of evidence and data. So there are quite a lot of information that needs to be provided, and this can lead to quite a lengthy process. But what it does mean is that it does result in a very robust and rigorous project design that is supported by evidence and been through a lot of local level consultation to provide, you know, really accurate and context specific approaches to the needs of the country. So with that, I'll move into the project development process. So just here to highlight that a full GCF project cycle has four main steps, which is broken down into 10 stages. So just to highlight those four main steps, the first is the strategy, origination and structuring of a project. So this particularly focuses on those early consultations between the National Designated Authority to the GCF and the accredited entity who might take forward the project to the GCF. This can also result in several sort of back and forths and other local level consultations as needed. This will then result in the development of a concept note that can be submitted to the GCF. The second step would be a technical review and appraisal of a full funding proposal. And the third step would then go through the approval under the GCF board and then legal arrangements for the financing agreements to set up the project and allow for disbursement from the GCF. And then the fourth and final step would be implementation, which would focus on obviously the implementation of the project on the ground, monitoring performance and compliance with GCF policies, any adaptive management based on the monitoring that comes through the project, and then evaluation, learning and project closure. So just to break down into the first step a little bit more, I highlighted that the first step is to you know, for the National Designated Authority and national counterparts to come up with a project idea to focus on where climate finance is needed to support local action you know, and result in concrete impacts to support climate resilience or mitigation. The next step would then be to target accredited entity to take the project forward and to develop the full design of the project. So this process would be an iterative consultation, so going back and forth from the National Designated Authority to prospective accredited entities to solidify the best organization to take the project forward and design that document. The concept note would then be developed and submitted to the fund, so either the Adaptation Fund, GEF, or GCF, but in this case, the GCF is who we're focusing on. But just to highlight here that this is the same process for all three of the funds. This strong country ownership and engagement at the initial stages. The fund will then approve the project and liaise with the country to make sure that it is in alignment with their country priorities and needs. So after this, and when the GCF endorses the concept note, the concept note is endorsed by the Climate Investment Committee of the GCF. So it's not the GCF board itself, but an internal committee within the GCF Secretariat. Notification will be made to the country that the concept is approved and can move forward to the full design stage. This is an essential step, as you get some very good information, targeted comments from the GCF that can strengthen the concept and lead to a more robust project design in the next stages. So once the concept is approved, we move into the second step, which is the technical review and appraisal of the funding proposal. So the first step is for the country and the accredited entity to develop the full funding proposal design documentation. So this is the full proposal template, along with all requisite annexes that the GCF would require. So including environmental and social safeguarding documentation. If you're category B or A, then you'll need to provide various levels of detail of an environmental and social impact assessment. Other annexes that you need to provide include procurement plans, budgets, fee requests, and a term sheet, along with gender action plans to ensure that the gender issues are incorporated into the project, which is a very significant part of the GCF's focus. Then the other annex of importance to highlight is the inclusion of a no objection letter. So this would come from the National Designated Authority and is essential for the GCF to take the project aboard. And it specifically indicates to the board that the National Designated Authority and the country support the project and would like to see it taken forward. So when it's submitted to the GCF will carry out a review of the project and provide comments. The first step of that is a secretariat review with the task manager and specific technical consultants who provide that overview. It then comes back to the accredited entity and country for responses. So just to highlight here that it is a sort of iterative process, and once responses are made by the accredited entity and country, then the project is resubmitted to the fund, and there can be several rounds of review whilst those comments from the GCF are addressed. Once the project is the review comments are addressed to the GCF Secretariat's satisfaction, then the project is sent to an independent technical advisory panel, or ITAP as it's known for short. Now this is a panel of independent and highly technical specialists, so who will be specifically signed onto the project based on their alignment with the sector and approach. Now they are being independent, they provide an arm's reach assessment of the project and provide their comments. This allows for a couple of iterations of back and forth between the ITAP and the accredited entity to answer those questions and to have the project meet their standards. Once the ITAP is happy that the comments are addressed, then they make a recommendation to the GCF board to approve the project or and any potential conditions that they might have for the approval. So with that, so just to highlight that step 3 would be the board approval, as mentioned, and on the approval of the board, then the financial activity agreement or the financing agreement between the accredited entity and the GCF will be negotiated and signed, locking in the project and allowing to proceed to next steps for fund disbursement from the GCF. Then the project is eligible to go into inception and start implementation, which carries out specific monitoring and performance and compliance. So there's annual performance reports every year within the project, and at midterm there is a midterm review and evaluation, as well as at terminal and completion, to allow for lessons learned to be incorporated into knowledge sharing mechanisms to enhance and improve any future projects that might go under the same approach. So with that, I'll stop there. That's just a quick overview of the GCF process, and yeah, just again to highlight that with those iterations and high requirements from the GCF, it can be a relatively lengthy process and can take as long as 2 years and maybe sometimes more, depending on the complexity of the project and the technical requirements for it. So with that, I'll move into focusing more narrowly down onto the key requirements to develop a concept note and what the GCF really wants to see from a robust project concept when it comes to them. So the first thing to highlight is the climate rationale. The Green Climate Fund being a climate-oriented fund, they really do want to see a clear link of all project activities to a climate output, climate-related output. They want to see all of that. They want to make sure that their financing is going to have an impact on increasing resilience to climate change impacts or mitigating carbon emissions. So with that, there's a couple of stages that are specific to developing the climate rationale and ensuring that it's robust for GCF to approve. The first of which is to have a detailed assessment of the climate impacts and data that to have a clear understanding of the climate impacts that are affecting the target country. So they like to see observed data, so looking at historical observational data that has been recorded in the country for the past 30 years that defines a trend in the climate change scenario. So if, for example, of temperature change over the last 30 years, has the temperature been increasing or has it been decreasing, or is it staying the same? The same for other climate variables such as precipitation, sea level rise, wind level and intensity of storms, etc. And then they'd like to see that mapped against projected climate models to identify the vulnerabilities that may occur in the future and for where resilience and adaptation funding is needed. So based on these observations and projections of the climate related trends, they need to be linked to specific impacts on your selected sector. So for example, if you've got an increase in precipitation levels and a higher incidence of flooding, then your impacts, if you're focusing on an agricultural sector project, maybe that you would suffer from increased flooding in croplands and arable farming systems that may lead to lodging and decrease of productivity or increased pest proliferations under certain conditions, et cetera. So really linking those climate observations and projections to specific impacts that could to affect the local communities in the specific sector. From there, and linking to the impacts, there needs to be an assessment of specific barriers at the country level that would prevent the country or local populations from overcoming those impacts in the future. So whether that's technical capacities and knowledge related to being able to overcome flooding scenarios, or to improve watershed management, or whether they're institutional issues related to enabling extension of information or policies and regulations that are in place to ensure that there is relevant safeguarding and implementation of climate resilient or climate safe practices at the ground level. And then finally linking the barriers to the impacts, and then identifying clear needs for either mitigation or adaptation that the project activities will address. So from this, it shows a clear flow of the need of the climate trends, the impacts, and then the specific needs to overcome country contexts to ensure that impact is made on the ground. So just here is as a little summary diagram of specific climate drivers to climate change impacts. And impacts. So just a little graphical implementation to highlight how that would work. So it's sort of at the different levels. So with that, I will pass on to targeting the GCF investment criteria. So in my first presentation, I highlighted that the GCF does have specific investment criteria that they do like to see. And these include a high impact potential. So the GCF wants to be able to see that there will be impact made at scale, and that their financing is really resulting in strong and tangible impacts at the ground level. So here they want to see, in terms of mitigation projects, I'd like to see tons equivalent of CO2 avoided or reduced. And in terms of adaptation, they want to really see, high numbers of direct or indirect beneficiaries that will have increased resilience to climate change impacts or natural disasters related to climate events. So it must respond to real vulnerabilities of the population and be focused on climate change. So in other words, it needs to have that real climate link and not just be your typical development approaches that might be more traditionally financed by other UN organizations that are more specific to other development challenges. So paradigm shift potential focuses on the project's ability to innovate and be sustainable and transformative. So by promoting the development of new technologies or by strengthening policies and developing incentives for increased impact at the national level or higher levels. So really creating a shift and behavioral change across the country so that there is a long-lasting impact and shift towards more climate resilient implementation. So sustainable development potential focuses largely on co-benefits. So looking at ensuring that there is economic, social, environmental, and gender co-benefits that relate from the project so that it is sustainable and holistic approaches that are implemented. Needs of the recipient. So this again highlights the need to be aligned with the country strategies, but also to really describe the scale and the intensity of the vulnerability of the country and its needs and the potential impacts that may occur without this funding. So to really highlight that the recipient country or countries may be definitely in need of the GCF assistance. And strong country ownership, again, yeah, just reinforcing that link to stakeholder engagement and alignment with national strategies such as the NDCs and national adaptation planning. And lastly, efficiency and effectiveness to demonstrate value for money and, where possible, a secure upfront co-financing to encourage longer-term investments beyond the GCF resources. So with that, those are our key points that need to be covered, but then also moving into the theory of change. This is really what a nice summary and representation of how the project will overcome specific barriers to lead to a positive change and a positive goal. So with that, there's several steps in the development of a theory of change that should be followed, and I'll run through those now in theory, and then we will go into the breakout groups in a short while to really focus on practical examples of putting together a robust theory of change. So I'll present here a quick sort of cyclic step to developing a theory of change, which in this is based on six processes. So the first of which is to describe the problem. So this links back to that initial, climate rationale and identifying the climate impacts that could be impacting negatively on local populations and beneficiaries. Identifying the barriers, so I covered this previously, so then linking that back to the impacts and what are the barriers to overcoming the projected and foreseen climate impacts. Then the third step is to identify the long-term vision or ultimate goal. Where do you want the project to take you? What is the overall goal that you want to see? Is it increased food security? Is it increased protection of fishery resources, etc.? And how will that be seen in the long term? Step 4 is to map a pathway of change. So that is to link the different stages of the theory of change. So linking the impact to the barriers and then the flow to the ultimate goal. I mean, what are the activities that the project will conduct and what outputs and outcomes will those activities have? How do they form together to combine to create that overall ultimate long-term vision and goal? So it's really filling in the meat of what the specific project will do to meet the expected vision. So pathway to change, and define the activities and identify the risks. So once that map of the pathway to change is done, so that includes the activities and then also identifying any risks to the project. So to identify any risks that may occur during the project and how those will be overcome, and then in final step, Article 6, to articulate the assumptions that are made within the project. The GCF likes to see the assumptions just to make sure that the project approach has been thought of in entirety and that is understood in the local context. Okay, so I'm afraid I missed my animations there. Okay, so with that, I'll just pass on to the next slide. I believe this is the last slide before I jump into the breakout groups. But just to highlight, this is the format that the GCF would like to see. So is present to the bottom there. The underlying assumptions made in the theory of change, then linking up to barriers and any risks that have been identified, and then looking at that pathway of change. What are the activities, outputs, outcomes, and then linking those to the impact or paradigm shift or overall long-term goal that the project envisions. So with that, I'll stop there, and then we'll now split out into two individual breakout groups to focus on going through a group exercise to develop a theory of change and to produce a robust concept for a GCF submission. So with that, there are four concept. So there are four breakout groups today. Unfortunately, yes, four. So we've got renewable energies technologies, coastal erosion and fisheries, ecosystem restoration, and agriculture. So with that, I'd ask my colleague Stephanie to now move us into the breakout groups, and I'd just like to remind the moderators to ensure that they do record their sessions. So I'll stop there and hand over to Stephanie, or if there's any further inputs that Dirk may want to make, but otherwise into the breakout groups.
Yes, Dirk, I think you have your hands up.
Not sure if Dirk is going to jump in, but otherwise, I just wanted to remind participants that you can, if you have not been assigned to a group previously through the polling system yesterday, then you are able to join the rooms by yourself based on the topic that you'd most like to address. So just checking in with Stephanie, we have the breakout groups been? Okay, yeah, the breakout groups are presented below. So for agriculture, the breakout group is in the main plenary. So with myself, and just to highlight that translation will be available for the agricultural group, but in terms of the other breakout room sessions, unfortunately, interpretation translation won't be available, unfortunately, due to the Zoom systems. But for those in agriculture, you'll be with me here in the main plenary, and I believe that interpretation is on offer. So thank you. So I'll just give 2 minutes. I don't know if everybody related to the agricultural sector is here. And then, yep, I will just initiate the session in a minute or so.
Thank you, Jack. Is there a time limit on the breakout rooms?
That's a good question. Let me just check on, we've got about an hour. Yep, so if we could finish the breakout rooms at 11:50, and then we'll just do a quick summary and move into, is the closing at 12? Sorry, Stephanie, Sadie, just to cross check.
The closing is at 11:40.
11:40, is that Noumea time or?
Noumea time.
The closing is at 11:40. Okay. So in that case, yeah, breakout groups to 11:35.
Okay. Thank you.
Then we can. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, well, so with that, for the agricultural team, if I could just ask if you can all hear me and whether you are able to see my screen. I am just about to share. And if you just bear with me 1 second. Can you all see my screen? Hello to those in the main plenary session with agriculture. Please feel free to unmute yourselves and participate in this session. Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So yeah, for this session, I mean, the idea is to build a concept note, so the theory of change that can be used for developing a robust concept note for the GCF. So we'll just run through some key key sections that I presented before. The first would be to describe the problem of a climate project. So could I ask, is there anybody in the group who may have an idea for a project that they would like to discuss that we could use as a case study? Hi there. Is anybody got an idea that you'd like to take forward for an agricultural project? Okay, I just wanted to really highlight here that that the session is really designed to be interactive and to get participation in ideas and thinking on how to align these processes to country needs. So yeah, please speak up if anyone has an idea for an agricultural project. Otherwise, so any participants that we have from outside of SPREP or SPC, does anybody have an idea? Otherwise, I can suggest a potential idea to take forward for an agricultural project. Okay, in that case, I guess I'll proceed with formulating an idea. So if I briefly touched on an agricultural project earlier in Papua New Guinea. So that is focusing on utilizing ecosystem-based adaptation and restoration approaches to aid in watershed management and support the agricultural sector, and specifically target small-scale farmers to enhance their productivity to overcome food security issues and increase local livelihoods. So with that, starting with describing the problem, this would result, observational trends in PNG and focusing then onto the projected climate for the project. So in the cases of, so this would result in, a high level, well, not high level, a very sort of specific local level assessment of climate trends and looking at the impact that they have. So in the case of PNG, there are various climate impacts that can hit based on the project. This, if we're looking at a national-based project, in certain areas, the project areas are likely to encounter droughts through the dry season, and in other areas, higher levels of rainfall and flooding through the wet season to cause issues. So in this, I would account for increasing temperatures and then variable rainfall. So from the climate perspectives, so variable rainfall that can result in drought and flooding. So the impacts specific to the climate sector that could the agricultural sector here is that in the case of heavy rainfall and flooding on steep slopes, this can result in high levels of soil erosion and loss of water in areas where through sheet erosion, where there is high levels of forest degradation. So without that vegetation cover, water hits onto steep slopes and doesn't have the time to infiltrate into groundwater reserves and can then carry off huge amounts of soil and soil nutrients that are needed for agriculture away and down into river systems and eventually into the sea, which as Mathilde presented earlier, can suffocate reefs and cause environmental damage. So one of the key aspects that we could focus on here under the context of PNG, which does have high levels of forest degradation in certain areas, is to focus on watershed management approaches that aim to rehabilitate the surrounding watersheds through forest regeneration. So focusing on building up the vegetative cover to prevent the heavy rainfalls landing on the steep slopes and causing sheet erosion. So we can also focus on various aspects of technical aspects related to agriculture to enhance agricultural outputs. So looking at various climate resilient varieties. Looking at agroforestry systems to allow for shade cropping of certain cash crops. So for example, in PNG, coffee is a major cash crop, but is best grown in shade systems. So we look to intercrop coffee with taller and profitable plant species, tree species that can be used to shade the coffee, but also provide economic outcomes for local communities. So those are two sort of basic approaches. We won't go into more detailed approaches just based on the timeframes that we do have. So sorry, not impacts there. I've gone to step ahead of myself there. Impacts should have been what I said: sheet erosion, loss of soils, and loss of water. So then moving on onto the barriers, what could be the barriers related to these impacts, to overcoming these impacts? So here I do want to just stop here, and if anybody does, please speak up related to this, and if you've got any barriers that could be related to any of the below mentioned categories here, to please speak up so that we can get some thinking in on this. So focusing on, are there any regulatory or institutional issues that are in place? So yeah, over to participants. So any thoughts at all? Please let me know. Okay, all right, so maybe I'll kick off again. So in terms of regulatory or institutional issues that we might have here, this could potentially be related to a lack of regulation in forest degradation, so that surrounding slope and highland areas that do provide water provisioning ecosystem services are not in place to safeguard against deforestation, so that the watersheds are highly degraded, which exposes soils to the heavy rainfall that can result in the loss of soils and nutrition required for healthy agricultural outputs. So in terms of that, we can highlight, that's not a text box, but that's okay. Regulatory barriers to prevent deforestation. On an institutional level, there might not be capacity for extension agents of the governments of agriculture to enable capacity building at the local level. So looking at improving capacity of ministries to carry out training at local levels. Financial barriers, it might be that there is not enough financing at the local level to enable rehabilitation of degraded lands. So financing be lacking. And then on gender issues, just to highlight how gender issue can play into these, is that gender roles in societies can have varied impact on resource use. So the use of natural resources within the water catchments might be very different between women and men that are going out into the surrounding areas to gather resources. So and ownership rights of land can also play into a major issue here, with traditional ownership rights being tending to lean towards male-dominated systems. So looking to establish more gender equity in the agricultural systems. So with that, and again, I think in the case of time, I'll move on to the next steps, as we don't have as long as I thought we had for the breakout rooms. So here, yeah, to identify the long-term vision. Again, please, I'm going to hand over to any participants to see if there is a long-term vision for the project. Anyone, please speak up. What could be our long-term vision for an agricultural adaptation or resilience project? Okay, so with that, I'll just put something down quickly. So from this, I would imagine that, you know, our approach would be to enhance the climate resilience of local, of smallholder agricultural systems to, enhance climate resilience of smallholder agriculture systems to ensure food security under the context. Sorry, my typing is not so great. Under the context of the changing climate. So that would be sort of our focus on a long-term goal. This is quite simplified in this case. And then from there would move to this next step, which is to map the pathway of change. So specifically from our long-term vision to happen, what outcomes need to be in place? So with that, anybody, please, if there's any thoughts out there, please let me know. No, okay. So potential outcomes that we would want from this would be to have restored ecosystems, in watersheds to enable greater water regulation and provisioning. We'd also want to see increased technical capacity at local levels. Yeah, so we want to see, okay, restored ecosystems to provide enhanced water regulation and provisioning, as well as reducing soil degradation. Although that becomes quite a long outcome, as well as also increasing technical capacity at local levels to implement climate resilient agricultural practices, rather than business as usual activities that may be you know, more harmful to the agricultural system, or not specifically targeted to increased climate impacts. So with that, moving on to divine activities. So we would want to achieve those outcomes. We would basically want to see several activities in place to make sure that those outcomes happen. So in terms of meeting the first outcome of restored ecosystems in watersheds to enable greater water regulation, we would want to focus on restoration of degraded steep slopes in watersheds. With that, we might want to rehabilitate using nature-based solutions. So we would want to focus on utilizing local and native tree species to repopulate any degraded landscapes to increase that vegetation cover. So for that, we might want to set up some tree nurseries. We related to the second outcome presented, which was increasing technical capacities at local levels to implement climate resilient agriculture practices. We would want to carry out training of trainers programs, so that countering the institutional barrier that we mentioned, that the ministries of agriculture may not have the capacity to disseminate the technical knowledge to local levels. And through that, we would want to set up farmer field schools to set up farmer field schools to disseminate knowledge at a local level. So to train farm level beneficiaries in climate resilient practices, so that they are able to implement those in their landscapes and create, the resilient approaches that we'd like to see, such as the agroforestry approaches of intercropping coffee with specific local fruit-bearing trees that have economic value. So with that, and considering we're moving into the final couple of minutes of the session, I think what we could do is I'll just hand over if there's any questions from participants. I know that it's just been me speaking and going through the steps, but if there's any specific questions, please do raise your hands now. And if there's any questions not related maybe to the theory of change, but any broader questions related to climate finance that you may want answered, I'm also happy to field any of those questions. Nope. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll stop sharing at this stage, and we can we'll move back into the plenary within a couple of seconds or a minute or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. We'll just wait for the other rooms to finish
Yeah,
off?
sure. I thought we had an hour and a half for this session, so I was expecting a bit longer
Yeah.
time for the breakout groups.
Yeah, I do. I understand.
Okay, yeah, no worries. But yeah, will the breakout groups automatically end and come into plenary, or how will that work?
Stephanie will.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you. Jack, I'll give it to you and Dick to round up all the discussions from the BOR.
Yep. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, I think everyone is back from the breakout rooms. I hope you've had a very fruitful discussion. I will now hand over to Jack and Dirk to quickly round up this session so that we may move into the closing of the training session. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadie, for that. So I think, yeah, what we wanted to do is just do a quick run through of the approaches. So just quick 2-sentence or 3-sentence rundowns of the theories of change or approaches that we took. So perhaps if I start, then we can move to Dirk, Melanie, Andrew, Penny in that order. So for myself, with the agricultural group, the long-term vision that we identified was to enhance climate resilience of smallholder agricultural systems, to enhance food security under the context of a changing climate. So we decided the specific climate threats were related to increasing temperatures and higher amounts of variable rainfall that could result in flooding during wet seasons. and the focus was to focus on the focus of the project and outcomes would be to restore ecosystems and watersheds to enable water regulation and provisioning, and reduce soil degradation, and increase technical capacity at local levels to implement climate resilient agricultural practices to meet the needs of the local populations, and specifically focusing on land restoration and training of trainers and capacity building programs at the local level to enhance capacities for increased agricultural climate resilient practices at the beneficiary level. So I'll stop there and hand over to Dirk.
Thanks very much, Jack. Yes, so the group that I was in was working on coastal erosion and fisheries. So the problem identified was that climate change is causing an increase in rainfall events, heavy rainfall events, which result in flooding and eventual damage to community assets, but also livelihoods. So the long-term vision then would be that these communities have their vulnerability to climate change reduced through having climate resilient, but also economically and environmentally sustainable fisheries, which addresses the livelihood challenges, but also climate resilient assets and infrastructure. Various types of infrastructure were discussed, tourism, but also things like buildings, churches, cultural sites, traditional burial sites. And so some of the activities, that could address this could be a mixture of hard, but also nature-based solutions. So things like seawalls, but then making sure that there are access for fishers to still be able to go to the ocean, marine protected areas, perhaps, mangrove buffers, and potentially relocation as well, all to be able to achieve this long-term vision. And making sure that these activities address the climate change risks. Thanks. Over to I'll pass on to Melanie, shall I? Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Dirk. I want to just say thank you to Roxanne, who was our translator as well. So our group was coastal ecosystem restoration. I think one of the lessons, sorry, I'm going a bit off your thing, though, Dirk, was welcome to our world. These things aren't easy, and it's not so simple to work through theories of change and map out your project ideas over Zoom and in 5 minutes. But we did get to the thing of looking at, our long-term vision was really around strengthening our coastal ecosystems to help improve our food security or increase our food security through fisheries. And from that, we were then really looking at what might the climate problem be, which is increased water temperatures. We've got storm surges and more cyclonic activity, etc. And then I think we really then moved just down looking at what potentially some of the barriers might be. And from that, I think is pretty much where we got to. So thanks. I'll do Rapeni.
Thank you. Just to continue on that, I'm in the renewable energy group. The interesting thing here, before diving into the theory of change, we try to look at what is the idea. We try to brainstorm on how do you look at the renewable energy. Is it feasible on its own? You just go and install a couple of wind turbines and solar PV systems. Is that feasible? Or should you integrate it with, for example, productive uses, such as renewable energy and agriculture, renewable energy and waste, for example. So these are just some of the discussions we thought we'll take a step back from the theory of change and look at the idea, look at the climate rationale behind that particular idea. If we can, I would say, kickstart the story, then your theory of change becomes quite easy to formulate. So we did not dive into trying to formulate the theory of change, but we're trying to look at what would be a good idea with renewable energy? Is there climate rationale behind it aside from the usual? Trying to ensure that the DCF metrics, with this respect, it's very difficult to meet. So the message here, renewable energy and productive use, so like renewable energy and agriculture. So that is our discussions. The group also shared, there's a couple of them who are already involved in developing project ideas in this area. So hence our discussion was trying to look at that. So that's all from our end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rupeni and colleagues. Just a few seconds to wrap up that session. But really the idea with the breakout groups was to start working through challenges that we're seeing, but making sure that they're framed in a climate change perspective, so that you would be able to meet the requirements of the donors. It sounds like each group had a slightly different approach or a slightly different way that the session was handled, regardless of the difference in topics. But that's normal as well, as you have different topics, but also different ways of viewing challenges and different ways of then formulating responses. I can certainly say that there's no single proper way or process for doing a theory of change. But then just highlighting, as Rupeni said at the end, that it's really critical in the theory of change, to be able to highlight that climate change problem, the climate rationale, to then in the end be able to formulate a good project. And so, moving ahead as we're looking at NDCs, nature-based solutions, and how can we access finance for that, whichever types of finance you're using, whether it's national, international, multilateral, bilateral finance, you have to make this story, the story of what the climate change impacts are, and what your future vision will be and how you get there. And that story that you tell, when you have that framed in all of the documentation, a theory of change, a results framework, models, predictions, all of the things that were mentioned in the groups, that's when you can eventually secure that funding that you need to address your challenges, whether it's for NDCs, nature-based solutions, whichever type of activities you're looking for. So I will stop there. Thank you so much. I just want to, before we hand over, say thanks very much to all of the participants, but also special thanks to the organizers and the hard work done by the IT team, the interpreters, all of the support work by the admin people, etc. It's been really great to be able to participate in this training, the good partnership between SPREP and SPC. And so we look forward to future trainings and working on these issues together. Thanks very much. Back to you, Sadi. Okay, I think, I don't know if Sadi is still, okay, Sadi has dropped out, unfortunately, so I will be the interim moderator, but she was just going to hand over, I think, to Melanie for some closing words. So Melanie, if you can take over there in Sadi's absence, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dirk, and I sort of support your comments, as well as thanking the organisers, and I think the NDC hubs and Kiwa initiative in particular, and SPC and SPREP, I guess, as well. We've been involved in it, and I think, as Dirk said, the intention is that these would continue or take, we move it forward in terms of the training. I know in the sessions today, I think that could be really interesting. So just a bit of a wrap up, I think, from the last 2 days that you've had. I think yesterday there were some interesting questions raised really around sort of what concrete actions can be implemented for different types of islands, particularly around atoll islands, and looking at how you could more strategically achieve against your NDCs. It was also really around looking at the issue of sustainability of NDCs in terms of country ownerships, and we hear a lot around the sustainability issue. And then also, I think there participants wanted additional information on what's requested by donors in project proposals, and also on how nature-based solutions can be more effectively implemented to address environmental issues. The other bit, probably just to add on that, you know, I think I do want to reiterate that it's also not necessarily for yourselves to have to come up with the whole theory of change or project proposal. And as Dirk and Jack have pointed out today, that is what your accredited entities and that are also there to help you with. I think also then today we've sort of been taken through the nature-based solutions landscape by Mathilde, and also looking at how NBS can actually assist in looking at mitigation adaptation priorities. And I think the breakout groups were sort of trying to touch on that as well and assist in understanding how you can take it a little bit further. And I think from module 2, I have here that the nature-based solutions, some of the key messages, nature-based solutions and EBA present opportunities for cost-effective approaches for mitigation and adaptation. The second one, the restoration, regeneration and protection of terrestrial and marine ecosystems support livelihoods. Healthy ecosystems are the best defence against climate change impacts to livelihoods and health, yes. Local and traditional ecological knowledge from different age and gender groups into adaptation efforts. And often adaptation strategies involve hybrid solutions combining green and grey interventions, and there are limits to the resilience of ecosystems, and ultimately we need to continue to flex for 1.5 degrees C and advocate for global GHG emission reductions, which probably I should have read that last because that's a great actually summing up. So I think to just really quickly, I think this process was about really just raising your understanding a bit more about the NDCs, about where nature-based solutions fit, and then also just giving you a snapshot of some of the potential financing mechanisms that you might be able to utilise or think about to sort of support your NBS ideas and your NDC priorities as well. And so I think I might leave it there and head back to hopefully Sadi's back on, or if not Dirk, for any sort of final questions from people. But there will be an evaluation. There was an evaluation for yesterday. There's another one today. I think the link has come out. So we also do encourage you to fill in that evaluation. It is important in getting the feedback and also then helping us all to think about what further training could be wanted and also possible as well. So thank you everyone for participating. I hope you learned something or came away with something of interest, and look forward to seeing you probably on the next round of the training. Thank you. Back to you, Dirk or Sadi.
Thanks, Melanie. I think Sadi's having problems connecting, so I'm happy to take the last few minutes. We've got 7 minutes of scheduled time left. So if there are any 1 or 2 questions that you want to pop in the chat quickly, we can try and address those as a last chance. Otherwise, just to say again, thank you very much for the organizers. Sadi and Roxanne did amazing work. I mentioned them already, but the IT team, the interpreters, also the presenters, and a big thank you to everyone else who joined, the participants. I know it's a big commitment to take 3 hours out of your day, 2 days in a row, but very much appreciate that you did take that time to join us. As Melanie said, there are evaluation forms to fill in. So please, if you complete those, it helps us to understand better what future training needs you might have, whether there's more targeted information needed on one topic or another. So we can encourage you, please, to fill out the evaluations. Otherwise, feel free to contact anyone basically who presented and to give us some feedback on what might be useful in future, which sort of formats, which sorts of topics would be useful. I'm looking through the chat and I don't see any questions there. No, only seeing some thanks and some comments. So yeah, with that,
Sorry,
then I'll.
Dirk.
Yes, sorry, Sadi, go for it. You're back
Yes,
on.
just to let everyone know that, thank you, Dirk, for taking over. Just to let everyone know that Ashika has sent out the evaluations for day 2 to everyone in ACA.
Okay, thanks. All right. So yeah, if you do fill those evaluations in, that will be useful. In that case, I will also end off. Thank you very much. Have a good Friday. Have a good weekend. Or it might still be Thursday for some participants, but yeah, have a good day. Have a good weekend. And we look forward to any future training opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.